Hello BookTube, it's Roz and I'm back for another scallydandle and with this book, which is How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Cherie Jones, and it's a book set in Barbados, and so it's a scallydandle to Barbados. Cherie Jones was born and grew up in Barbados. She trained as a lawyer there, worked as a lawyer there, and she lived in England for a while, and now I think she's living and working in Barbados again. So yeah, it's very definitely a Barbadian or Bayan book, and I was really keen to do a video about this particular book for a few different reasons. Now, one reason is that I've been really struck looking back at my kind of past year's reading, I guess, about how much really tremendous new writing there is coming out of the Caribbean at the moment, and including particularly by women authors. And I'm thinking of Love After Love by Ingrid. Now I want to say Persaud, but I have a feeling actually she pronounces it differently because Persaud would be the English Indian pronunciation. Persaud, maybe. Anyway, she's from Trinidad. Brilliant book. Came out in 2020. I read it last year. Another would be The Mermaid of Black Conch by Monique Roffey. She's from Tobago. Another warm recommendation of a book from me, really interesting novel. One that I'm really looking forward to reading is That One Sky Day by Leonie Ross from Jamaica. And there's, that's just a few. And so real strong, vibrant, interesting contemporary writing. And when I did my roundup of the year and had to pick my sort of 10 top favourite contemporary novels written in English, those three books, this one and Love After Love and The Mermaid of Black Conch, were like the three that sort of just missed out. So it's really nice to talk a bit more about one of them now. And I have talked about the other two in previous videos. The other thing is that a week ago I did a video about a book from St Kitts and Nevis, Only God Can Make a Tree by Bertram Roach, and I said that that was an interesting book, which I was glad to read because it was from St Kitts and Nevis, but it wasn't a great book, if you know what I mean. So I almost want to balance that out by talking about a book by an author from that part of the world that I'd say is really, a 100% enthusiastic recommendation from me. So let's go for it. Now, we usually start, don't we, with just locating the place that we're talking about. And sorry, I'm using the royal we. That's a bit pretentious, isn't it? Well, the place I'm talking about. So here's my trusty globe. Now then, here we have the Caribbean, between North and South America, in the sea here. We have the Leeward and Windward Isles that sort of curve round here. Barbados is the furthest east of the Caribbean islands. To the south of it, you've got like St Vincent, the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, but they're actually a little bit further west. Barbados is the furthest out, sort of into the Atlantic, if that makes sense. So it's here, and it's the furthest that way. It's not a huge place. Oh, to be fair to the book that I read from St Kitts and Nevis is tiny. I think the population is about 53,000. Barbados is about coming up for 300,000, so about the same size as the city that I live in England called Brighton. So gives you a sense of scale. Still, it's not a huge population from which to have some really hot new fiction, as this is. What else do we know about Barbados? I think for those of us that don't live in that part of the world, probably the thing we associate it with most would be very glamorous tourist destination. It's very beautiful, your classic sort of island, beautiful beaches, all of that. It's actually one of the better off Caribbean islands. having said that, it has a sort of a significant sort of strand of quite extreme poverty, and that is absolutely something that you see in this book. You see the sort of well-off visitors. You see the sort of expat people that come and live there perhaps for part of the year, have a own a property there and love to visit, and their interactions with the sort of local population. But you also see people, the sort of middle strand of people, just getting on with their lives locally, perhaps not dependent on that distorting impact of the tourist industry. So a mixture, and you get that mix across the characters in the book. You also get, I suppose, a picture of Barbados in the sort of mid to later 20th century, because most of the action in the book takes place in 1984, but we go back. We have little bits in 1948, or sometime in the mid 60s, and a bit in 1979. So, we get a flavour, I suppose, of those different time periods. It's very cleverly constructed book in that respect. It doesn't go chronologically. It takes us back and forth to sort of give us the background to the quite intense events in 1984 that happen over just a few days. So it's that combination of in the structure of looking back, giving you background, and then real sort of rapid events in a short time period. And even those are not told exactly from beginning to end. Yeah, you know what I mean. Bit non-linear, but not totally. It's relevant to say a little bit, as I usually do, about the history of Barbados. The sort of less relevant but still interesting bits is, like most Caribbean islands, it was settled in the dim and distant past by Amerindian people, the Arawaks. Then the Kalingo move in, or Island Caribs, they're also known as, and sort of take over. The Portuguese and Spanish kind of pass through but don't really linger in Barbados. It's the English. It's an island that was settled by the English in 1627. The first English settlers moved in on Barbados, and they exploit it for tobacco, indigo, cotton, and of course, above all, sugar. Now, something that we don't always talk about, I guess, when we're talking about those Caribbean islands, and this is particularly relevant in Barbados, was that initially the labour force for producing these very profitable cash crops was mostly actually poor white European indentured labourers. Some came voluntarily, and initially, they could come, kind of work for a certain number of years, and then would get like a plot of land and be able to settle. But then, over time, it became more that they stayed as their prospects weren't so good, so people perhaps weren't so keen to come voluntarily. People were brought as prisoners of war. Irish people, some people were pretty much kidnapped and brought to work there, although not technically slaves, but brought against their will. And the descendants of that kind of poor white, as opposed to rich settler landowner population, are called the Redlegs, which is relevant to the story, as will appear, and wasn't a term that I'd ever heard of before. So I love it when every time I read a book from a different place, I'll get some different little nugget of information that I didn't previously have. But obviously from 1640s onwards, it's all about sugar, it's all about sugarcane, sugar cultivation, sugar production. And that is very, very labour intensive, and the sort of use of indentured labour was not enough to make it as profitable as, those people really wanted. and hence they turned to enslaving Africans and bringing them against their will to Barbados, and to and obviously then that goes on for the next 200 years basically. After the end of slavery, those plantations or estates carry on, but in the 20th century you get a shift to the sort of black population having more opportunities and becoming more in some cases more prosperous. And so the 1968 sort of 1948, get your numbers right, Ross. The 1948 strand of the book is about a poor young but pretty girl from the Red Leg sort of population that I mentioned, and her becoming the mistress of a sort of one of the sort of newly well-off black businessmen and professionals, and their daughter is Mira, who is sort of semi-recognized by her father, but who sort of winds up as a young woman, as a kind of somewhere between an escort and a kind of bar girl, but at the kind of less desperate end. And from that becomes the second Mrs. Whelan, married to a kind of wealthy English businessman. And they live in England and come back to spend sort of a good chunk of the year in Barbados each year. They met in Barbados. He loves Barbados. So that's one strand, one of the main characters in the book. But this story is really the story of Lala. And we meet Lala in 1984 as a teenager who is pregnant by her no good criminal low-life boyfriend Aidan. Her mother kind of came to a sticky end. She was brought up by her grandmother. She had a lot of promise, but that sort of being brought up by her grandmother was not as cozy and secure as that might make it sound. A lot of different traumas and difficulties in there that have meant she sort of fell into the path of Aidan. She also has a friend Tone, who is a bit of a beach bum, a kind of informal sex worker with older tourist women, and is a kind of gentler but quite traumatized character. So they're your main protagonists, as it were. The key thing to know about this book, before you think about reading it, is that this, different forms of physical and sexual violence and domestic abuse and so on are layered through this whole book. They're layered through the different time periods in the book. They're layered through all the different characters in the book. It's full on. It's quite brutal. It's quite unrelenting. Cherie Jones, the author, has been quite open about the fact that she has, experience of domestic abuse in her family and in her own life. That said, this is, and obviously this was in her mind when she, this is important to her in writing the book, but it's not a messagey book. This is a book about character. It's a book that's very tightly plotted. It's not a book that's there to make a point, even though a point may be made. It's a debut novel, which I just was really impressed by her skill in putting together this book, the quality of the writing and the quality of how it's constructed and the quality of the characterization for a first novel. You would not have guessed that, I think, if you didn't know. One of the things that she does in the book is, I've mentioned that she dips into different time periods, but then writes quite intensely about a short time in 1984. She also goes in and out of a number of different voices, and I've talked about Mira, Mrs. Whelan, and Lala, our sort of main teenage protagonist. We also hear from Aidan, we also hear from Tone, we hear from grandmother Martha, we hear from a police constable and his sort of semi-sex worker girlfriend. So we move through perspectives. And that, you might think, oh, well, does that make it hard to grasp or follow as a book? No, you carried through by her very well constructed plot and by the fact that all these characters are quite rounded, they're quite human, they're quite rich. You get into their heads very readily, and they're characters that will stay with you after you finish reading this book, particularly Lala and Mira, I think, but also Tone. I would say he's a character who was very real to me and has definitely stayed with me since finishing reading it. So she carries that off, basically. That's what I'm saying. And you're left at the end of the book. There's a sort of quite violent, dramatic denouement. And I'm avoiding all plot spoilers in the course of this book. But what I would say is every character in the book is flawed. Some more so than others. Aidan is pretty out and out, no good, whatever. But yet, when you get the bit in his childhood, everyone has context and reasons and why they've ended up in the place that they have. It's at the end, I suppose, I was so engaged with the characters that I was left kind of hoping that there would be a happier future for some of them, in that way, as if they had real lives that were going to perhaps continue after the end of after I closed the last page. And so this is a wholehearted recommendation if you want to read a book that gives you a taste of Barbados. If you're reading around the world, this fits the bill for that. But it's just a good character and plot driven novel that is really well written in evocative and vibrant language that as long as you are not too overwhelmed by the thought of reading something quite grim and brutal and with not a lot of lightening up, then please do read this novel. And if you have read it, I would love to hear your thoughts about it.